Hey everybody, this is herculespetix, founder, curator, docent, and gift shop employee of the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies. Today we're going to be looking at Anything Goes, 1986 to 1987 anthology published by Fantagraphics Books. This was a benefit comic. Fantagraphics was sued by Michael Fleischer, the comics book writer, and there was a lot of legal costs. Fantagraphics won eventually, but they still, it's expensive mounting a defense, even a successful one. So all these great writers and artists, and not so great writers and artists, contributed stories to this anthology, and all the money went to Fantagraphics so they wouldn't go under, because they were very close to going under. This lawsuit could have just crippled them, and that would have been kind of sad if Fantagraphics ended in 1986. So luckily this comic helped stave that or stop that. And it's a really interesting anthology. I kind of wish more anthologies were like this. Because there's no editorial policy except, oh, it's a free comic you're giving us. So it's all over the place. And I kind of wish more anthologies were like that. You know, like, there's artists in here from the underground, totally from the superhero world, mainstream artists, indie world, just all these different genres and styles colliding. So it's kind of fun. So here we have number 1. Nice stylish logo by Kevin Nolan. And a new cover by Gil Kane. This colored by Mark Wheatley, the 80s, mostly 80s artist who did that Mars comic for First. He colors a lot of the stories in this book and some of the later ones. But this is the first new Savage story since the late 60s. Gil Kane's Savage was one of the first, some say one of the first graphic novels, even though it was only like 52 pages, a magazine. But this was quite a generous offering from Gil Kane. We have a little editorial explaining the lawsuit and the need for this comic. And this Gil Kane Savage story we start off with. Gil Kane does everything except the colors. And the colors are by Mark Wheatley. Pretty nice colors. It's newsprinty paper, but it is like better than your average Marvel DC newsprint at the time. It obviously can hold a much wider palette of colors and tones than like a Marvel DC comic could at the time. So Mark Wheatley is doing some kind of interesting early painterly colors. And this is just a typical Savage story, very macho, very violent. I guess these bad guys want to take out Savage. He outwits them and blows them all away. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It says watch for the return of Savage soon, but that never happened. So I guess this is pretty much it. This next story is Who's Stronger? Jan Strnad, writer, the great underground writer, also mainstream writer, and art by Gilbert Hernandez. And this is an autobio tale of Jan Strnad. And he's just talking about how he was so obsessed with comic books as a child, especially superhero comic books, because he had no power. And he only got over comics when he started getting laid, basically. He says that giving a woman an orgasm was like having superpowers. The whole time his wife is kind of ribbing him. And he tells a story about how he broke his wife's ex's hand from 1,600 miles away Basically made him so angry that the ex punched a refrigerator and broke his hand. I like this thing here is, and another thing, you love me, he's telling the wife. That gives me power over you. And she just nonchalantly says, yes, but you love me more than I love you, so I'm more powerful than you are. Here we have a nice one-page contribution from Alex Toth, doing everything on the page except for Mark Wheatley colors once again. Pretty interesting colors yet again. And this is just Alex Toth talking about heroes and how he misses the good old-timey heroes of yesteryear. Really nice cartoon in there. Here we get a science fiction story written by Mike Barron of Nexus fame and drawn by Dave Garcia. Drawn pretty poorly, I must say. This looks like fanzine art. This is not very good. Kind of interesting story, though. I mean, it's not bad. Apparently this guy worked for this big corporation. There was some explosion, and some of this experimental metal got into his brain. They then went on to use that experimental metal on the satellite, and he realized that because the metal was in his head that was in the satellite, he had this like sympathetic thing to it. He could feel like when the satellite's flying through the stratosphere, he feels like he's flying. So he totally lives in pain, but he does have this connection to the satellite. So he basically calls it home. That's why the story's called Come to Papa. And then we see the satellite's about to hit the skyscraper. And the CEO, this shitty, heartless CEO, is just like, oh, fuck. And there we see the outcome. Here we have a nice Mr. Monster intro framing device. It's written and drawn by Michael T. Gilbert, creator of Mr. Monster. But it's really just a little intro page to this silly story written by Scott DeShane, who we've seen before. He writes stories for Jim Woodring sometimes, but also worked with Michael T. Gilbert quite a lot in the 80s. And this is a weird story about a guy who has this weird psychosexual thing about driving and crashing into people. Like, that's how he meets women. He hits them with his car and then, you know, takes him to the hospital, and it's very strange. When he goes to the hospital, there's like 4 girls being like, Joey, I'll be at Attraction next month. And then the irony is that he finally meets the one because some woman hits him with her car. So, kind of a cute little funny story. Drawn in Michael T. Gilbert's humorous style. Oh, this is nice. Bob Burden contributes a Flaming Carrot story, I Carrot. And this is almost just like a treatise or a primer on Flaming Carrot. He's just talking about himself, and if you like Flaming Carrot, you'll like it a lot. I am grim and harsh and ripe with fury. I fight and kill and howl and get all bloody. I go bowling whenever I want. Just typical Bob Burden silliness. Telling us about his powers and his a little bit of his history. Climbing walls with toilet plungers, bounding across rooftops on a nuclear-powered pogo stick, standing with vigilance on the city skyline. Flaming Carrot, will he be the beginning of a new comic book tradition or the last dying gasp of an old one? Here we have some Cartoon Man strips by Mark Hempel, Mark Wheatley's partner on that Mars strip that I mentioned earlier. Some of these used to be in, I think, Eclipse magazine. He had this little character named Cartoon Man, Mark Hempel did, and the whole shtick was that he played with the comics form. Like, you've seen this before, you know, this kind of stuff, but this guy's looking at the panel down here and saying, hey, why is that going on? And then she's saying, hey, I look shocked and disgusted down there. And then she's looking over into this panel saying, why have all the... And these guys are looking up her skirt up to this panel. So it's that kind of playful, you know, comic book stuff. And here's the second one, In the Gutter. They're kind of fun. Okay, Anything Goes number 2. So this is right after Ronin came out, and Frank Miller contributes a Ronin cover. So I don't know if this has ever been reprinted in any of the Ronin collections. So I think this is kind of like if you're a Frank Miller completist, especially if you're like a fan of Ronin. This is kind of a treat, you know. Of course, Lynn Varley doing colors, beautiful colors like she do. Oh, so here's the infamous story in Pictopia. I'm sorry, it's just called Pictopia. Alan Moore contributed this, probably the longest story. I think it's 13 pages. Donald Simpson draws it with assists from Pete Poplaski and Mike Cazalet. So this story's been reprinted many times, and it's an amazing story. Alan Moore hadn't even written The Watchmen at this point, so he was kind of an up-and-coming writer. And it's this city, Pictopia, where all the comic characters live. It has a very like Roger Rabbit feel to it, this story. And it kind of reminds me of it, even though it's more about like mainstream superhero type comics. Our main character is kind of a Mandrake the Magician knockoff. His neighbor is like this little Nemo guy who was his nightmares. This is what Pictopia looks like. Oh, I guess the actual title is called In Pictopia. You know, the buildings are all like comic panels instead of windows. The roof here says, meanwhile. And of course, it's Alan Moore, so everything's grittier, you know. Mandrake's leaving. Let me see what his real name is. I guess I could just call him... Oh, his name's Nocturno in this Mandrake knockoff. We see this this woman who is a knockoff of Blondie. And it looks like she's taking Popeye. Well, I'm sorry, this is probably like Captain Easy home, and like, I guess Deadwood, her husband, that's in this reality. It's Deadwood and Red instead of Blondie and Dagwood. Deadwood, I guess, is drying out in a sanitarium, so she's been bringing home Johns, selling her body to make ends meet. So she's pretty embarrassed that Nocturno saw her. So here's where we get Mike Cazalet's contribution. I guess he likes to walk through the funny animal section of town. It's kind of like a ghetto, you know. And just like in Roger Rabbit, they can hurt each other as much as they want, and it doesn't injure them. And he says, everywhere people strolled perfectly syncopated from sight gag to sight gag. These people, they were so lively, so talented. They made just walking around seem like poetry. But there's no money because nobody cares about funny animals anymore. On the outskirts of the city, he finds his friend Flexible Flynn, one of the few superhero types he can stand. Obviously, Plastic Man. And they're both noticing that the horizon seems to be getting closer every day. And the horizon is just like weird. It's like just like this boiling morass. So they decide to get a beer at Captain Billy's, the bar. Here's where we got Peter Poblaski's contribution. If you guys know Peter Poblaski, longtime associate and worker at Kitchen Sink, also known as a great mimic. Every now and then he'll like, hey, we need somebody to imitate this great artist from the 30s or whatever. So this is kind of fun. It's Pete Poblaski going crazy, drawing all these characters from comic book history, and pretty damn good. He even sneaks in like Snappy Sammy Smoot from the Undergrounds. Flexible Flynn here has a totally great Crumb homage, just stoned again. He's getting drunk and the same thing that happens in Stoned Again. So Nocturno leaves and he sees a bunch of the new superhero types just abusing a funny animal character. Funny animal characters are so broke that they'll be like, hey, you can beat the shit out of me for $0.25 or $1. And these sadistic modern superhero types, are like, yeah, great. Just so many clever ideas in every panel on this, every caption. Alan Moore packs it with just so many references and allusions to almost all of comic book history. Here's some of those new superhero types, because this is around the same time when, in the 80s, when all the superheroes were getting gritty and, the Punisher was popular. Where it was almost like a hard time telling the superheroes from the supervillains. Even though Alan Moore is kind of a part of that. But obviously in this comic you realize he's not happy with it. Pete Poblaski doing some more great caricatures and homages. When he goes back to Captain Billy's, he sees a lot of the super folk and see how they're like totally in full color. Because, he lives in the black and white part of the city where all the poor characters, basically non-superhero characters. Because even by the mid-'80s, that's the only genre that was left in comics for the most part. And to his horror, he sees Flexible Flynn has been rebooted and now is like one of those asshole superhero frat boy type guys. So Nocturno's really just in a tizzy. And he runs to Funny Town, where the funny animal characters live. He wants some consolation. And these construction guys there, they've bulldozed the whole thing. No more Funny Town. And it sounds like they just killed all the animals there. And when he goes to that fence that surrounds the town, he sees the horizon getting closer and closer. He describes the horizon as a vast creeping industrial mass wreathed in factory smoke and lit only by furnaces. Sometimes it looks as if it's getting closer, but that may be an illusion born of the distance. And that's it. Seriously, one of the best stories of the 80s. I mean, well, maybe even after. Just a great story, and I love that, total freebie. Alan Moore is just like, he promised him an 8-page story, and then he called them back and said, guys, this is taking on a life of its own. Can I make it 13? And they're like, sure, thanks, Alan Moore. And became a little production. So this was at the time pretty awesome. A new Maggie and Hopi story. Then again, Love and Rockets wasn't that old and respected yet. Wasn't as world famous. This story was reprinted in many Love and Rockets collections, so you don't, if you're a completist, you don't need to get this. Just a very typical Maggie and Hopi story. Rand Race comes to visit Maggie, and now that she's chubby, she's all freaking out. It's like, I don't want him to see me like this. Just a cute little story. But just beautiful Jaime Hernandez cartooning. Here we got a Sam Keith story of the Max fame. This one's ridiculous. I mean, it's meant to be. It's pretty funny. And speaking of those abstract, pretentious stories that make you feel stupid if you don't get them. And it like is trying to be like that kind of story. Almost like as if it's some like fable laden with metaphor. And that just has this zany ending. This is very goofy. Kind of fun. That's a really young Sam Keith there. He had barely done anything at that point. This is really sad to me. This is a contribution from Jack Kirby and Joe Sinnott. And we see Silver Star and Captain Victory. And this is the first time Joe Sinnott has inked Jack Kirby in a while. So, I mean, he was very generous and quite a coup. But it's just like, Jack Kirby's obviously got a little senile. This is just really sadly, pathetically dumb. And like, it's this horrible pun. Behold, Captain Victory. He's in search of the rare video rock. By George, we've got it. So I guess to Jack Kirby, you know, MTV was new and he was trying to make this joke. But it's just so sad. Oh, I'm sorry. And there's a third page. Wait till they see the back of the video rock and find out that it is naught but an egghead sonata. So even though that is pretty loopy and zany, I really do like that last page. But still, just, man, Jack Kirby used to be such a master of, you know, epic wonder and splendor. And this is one of his last things he ever drew. Kind of sad. Here we have a very, speaking of those pretentious stories that Sam Keith was making fun of, this is Just That Thing. Lyrics by Jack Cronin, art by Dennis Fujitaki, longtime Fantagraphics contributor, great cartoonist. So sad how little this guy has done over the years. Because even back when he was a teenager doing fanzine art, he was already this good. He just was amazing. Just a master cartoonist. But, you know, he hasn't done much. I assume he's probably a very successful commercial artist or something. Yeah, this is really not worth recounting this tale. It's very, very sappy. But it's nice to look at the Dennis Fujitaki art. Oh, so here we have an Art Spiegelman comic. I guess he just gave them permission to reprint it, because this is from like 1973. And Walt Disney lives. And it predicts this future where Walt Disney's thawed out and he takes over the government, moves the capital to Anaheim, and rounds up everyone and turns them into animatronic robots who all behave. Really just dense cartooning. I mean, he packs in a lot of jokes and funny stuff in every page. Pretty nice stuff. So that's it for that issue. Number 3. This is kind of crazy. Neil Adams drawing Cerebus. and doing a damn good job. That was the thing, Neil Adams, such a great kind of photorealistic type artist. And yet when he could do funny, like I have an old fanzine where he does Atomic Mouse on the cover, and it is just like great. It's like he could have drawn Disney comics and they would have looked good. This is illustrating a little vignette that Dave Sim contributed, a Cerebus vignette, which is right here. And this is very slight, but it's nice to get this, prime 80s Dave Sim cartooning. And colors by Tom Luff. Yeah, not much, but, if you're a Cerebus fan, you gotta have this. This is a Last Blood, story by Marv Wolfman, art by Gary Kwapis. Gary Kwapis was worked for Fantagraphics for years. He was like the editorial cartoonist in the Comics Journal, would do spot illos for them. But by this point, he had already gone on to be, I think, a pretty regular artist on like Savage Sword of Conan. I think he did a lot of Conan stuff. Pretty good stuff in that, very mainstream style. But this story is a lot of amazing detail. It looks pretty good. I mean, almost some of it looks like it could be like Paul Galassi inspired, And there's just some story about this vampire, very powerful vampire. And he's kind of sick of running and being hounded. So he uses his power of influence and makes the president make to launch the nuclear bombs. Start World War III. Because he wants to go back to a simpler time when technology was not as as advanced. Because the modern world's hard for Dracula. They've got better surveillance, better guns, computers. He wants to go back to like the Middle Ages level of technology. So, but I guess he hasn't been reading science journals. Whoa, look at that crazy color. That's some wicked painted color there. He hasn't been reading science journals apparently because, of course, it just pretty much kills everyone. It's not like it just will set Earth back to the 1500s. We have way more nuclear bombs than that. So there's no one for him to eat, and he's the last person on Earth just slowly dying and yet undying. So he fucked himself up, fucked himself over. This kind of weird one, Howard Cruz, beautiful cartooning from Howard Cruz. We've seen Howard before, great, underground cartoonist. And it's a comic story called Purchaser's Clearinghouse. And the whole thing is a song with verses and chorus. The words are by, the words are by Marty Lyles, who I guess is a lyricist, is a songwriter. So he's just illustrating this goofy song. This kind of yokel guy is just like talking about how great the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes are. Even the sheet music is here. Maybe this is a real song and Howard Cruz just illustrated it. I don't know. I've never heard of it. But yeah, Howard Cruz, just such a fun cartoony style, like classic. Fun stuff. Oh yeah, look at this beautifully illustrated last page here. Some nice stuff. Next we have Captain Jack in The Laundromat at the Edge of Everything by Mike Cazalet. Mike Cazalet was actually an animator. And as you could see, he has a very classic, like Chuck Jones inspired style. So he did comics in like Critters, Fantagraphics Funny Animal comic, and even had his own solo title. One of the earliest titles Fantagraphics put out. soon after Love and Rockets and a handful of others, they started putting out this Captain Jack comic. And I never read them, but from this story, they're pretty fucking terrible. He does have this facile, old-school cartooning, Warner Brothers cartoon style. But yeah, the jokes are just insipid. And then look how just like spare this art is. Just because he's, this cartoony doesn't mean he should be this lazy. Like, this is just lazy cartooning. Just everything looks bare, the backgrounds. And just really, like, this guy has a bad sense of humor. All the jokes fall flat, and they're not very funny at all. Even the coloring's kind of Like, I don't know, just all these weird primary colors clashing against each other. I always knew there was a reason why I never picked that comic up. It didn't look very good in the first place, and now I know it was really bad. Here's an ad for Captain Jack right there. Oh, this is nice. For losers only. It's a Lloyd Llewellyn story, and it's Dan Clowes, the early Dan Clowes, back when he was kneeling at the altar of Bernard Krigstein all the time. But I mean, what a great, comic artist to emulate, if you're going to emulate someone, with his amazing lettering. And it's just Lloyd Llewellyn. There's not much of a plot. He's just talking about this, the Lonesome Road and Heartbreak Hotel, and it's just basically city for losers. Welcome to the land on the blue side of lonesome. I am the king of the losers. Those who set sail on the sea of heartbreak always wash up here eventually. So it's just all kind of like stuff about like that. Nice. I'm pretty sure this was reprinted in the complete Lloyd Llewellyn, so. Here we have Mark Wheatley, this time doing everything. Writing and drawing and coloring. And I guess this is a character he had, Up, Ultimate Potential, this alien super being. And he's friends of all these hobos. And he basically fights the rain clouds. Because he's very naive, this character. This isn't a very silly story. It's Pat Boyette, the great cartoonist from 60s, 70s, well, all the way up to probably the 90s. And he basically says that a comet will come by Earth, and the strange radiations emanating from it will basically desiccate everything. People's clothes will just turn to dust. Cars, all the metal will just rust. Of course, paper products just turn to dust as well. It's very like a post-apocalyptic world. But the whole point is that one comic book will survive. And this one comic, since it's the last comic book left, will be $10 million. It would be unfair to say the name of the comic, except to say it will be published by Fantagraphics sometime in 1986. So maybe you should buy 10 copies of every Fantagraphics book for the next year. So that's the joke. Pat Boyette obviously made this for Fantagraphics in their lawsuit. Number 4, we got a George Perez cover. We have a new Palomar story by Gilbert Hernandez. This was reprinted in Love and Rockets collection, so you don't have to hunt this down if you love Gilbert stuff. A really great story. Space Case. Where one of Luba's daughters is just freaking out, thinking about the universe. It's like blowing her mind. Just because I'm the same way. Sometimes I think about just how big the universe is, and I don't want to think about it. It freaks me out. I like this. She looks out her window, and, you know, obviously a starry, starry night, Vincent van Gogh homage. And, of course, like in most Palomar stories, everything goes back to normal. But a great little story. This is when Gilbert could do no wrong. So good. Here we have a little story, Dance Class. Story by Arn Saba of Neil the Horse fame. Pictures by Trina Robbins. Lettering by Tom Wojciechowski, and Marie Severin colors this, which is kind of odd. And this is just this cute little vignette about this woman. I think it's Trina. It's supposed to be Trina Robbins. She's all busy and frazzled in life, but then she goes to her dance class and has this like wonderful time, and it makes the rest of her day joyous and happy. Oh, this is beautiful. H.P. Lovecraft's The White Ship, adapted by Alex Stevens. Alex Stevens did a bunch of stuff for like Fantagraphics anthologies like Prime Cuts. He's just amazing. He came out of nowhere with this amazing style. Well, many styles. He would change his style a lot. In fact, this is a unique style for him. This is very like almost. I see a lot of Winsor McKay with the thick outlines and the crazy colors. But just in general, a lot of like what Art Nouveau's in here and stuff. But it's this old H.P. Lovecraft story, and just look at this gorgeous colors and stuff. It's really zany. This is a story of a guy who's a lighthouse keeper. This white ship comes and takes him away, and he visits all these crazy lands. It's very fantastical for an H.P. Lovecraft story. Not horrific, really. More just fantasy-based. But this is some really nutty looking art. I like it. It's really interesting and different and just ambitious too. Because I think this guy had just been drawing comics for a year or two at this point. It's kind of funny because a lot of this actually seems like Promethea was looking at this art. J.H. Williams III kind of reminds me of it. Certain panels. But yeah, I'm crazy about Alex Stevens, man. I wish somebody would put out a collection, because he did a lot of little short stories for Fantagraphics. You could definitely fill up a nice little graphic novel. He did those 2 graphic novels for Piranha Press. So there could be a nice book of just probably a couple hundred pages or more of just Alex Stevens's work. And I don't know what happened to him. I should look it up, but whenever I tried, I don't really see what he's done since then. This is kind of a weird one. It's The Divisible Man by Mort Todd. Mort Todd was the editor of Cracked magazine for a while. And he also did some stuff with Dan Clowes in the 80s. Mort Todd would write scripts for Dan Clowes to draw. And this is, I believe, I know it's lettered by Dan Clowes. Let me double check here. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it's inked by Dan Clowes. So this is a young Dan Clowes. He hadn't even started 8-Ball. And he was friends with this Mort Todd guy who definitely loves retro old school comics. And this is an homage to goofy old crazy superhero comics where all the villains were nuts. And we see this guy here, Mr. Crime, who's the narrator. I believe this guy was a real narrator for some crime comics in the 50s. There was a line of comics where they had a host named Mr. Crime. And he's just giving us the profiles of these 3 villains, basically seeing if they're worthy to join his army of crime. We meet the Blockhead. And we meet... Oh, and I'm sorry, I should say. And of course, the Divisible Man defeats these villains one by one. We see Bazonga Joe, obviously Bazooka Joe. He's even hanging out with a guy, and he calls him Mortimer, but you know that's Mort. Divisible Man foils him. And then we meet the Lobster, this little guy who made this giant, strong lobster suit so he could commit crimes. And the Divisible Man stops him too. Sends them all to jail. This is very silly, but definitely fun. I'd probably want to read more of these, actually. It's very retro, just like unabashedly just being like, let's just make a comic as if it was 1948 again. Here's Gary Fields with his Enigma Funnies. This was one of the serials that was in Threat magazine. Fantagraphics had a comic called Threat with 3 storylines. I think this guy was an animator as well. He's kind of got this cute cartoony style, but not so much, not that great. But I don't know. Just a silly little story. I'm pretty sure there's a reprint because it says copyright 1984. But we get a nice Peter Bag, Girly Girl and Chucky Boy. Once again, this is kind of early in Peter Bag's career. He had just started Neat Stuff at this time, I believe. And this is just wonderful old Peter Bag cartooning. I think I've mentioned how I miss this over-the-top, zany, crazy, gnarly style. He's definitely toned down, you know, in his old age. And to wrap it up, we have a nice little sequence from a Popeye story arc. Because at the time, Fantagraphics was publishing the complete EC Cigars Popeye. That's kind of nice. I don't own any of those Popeye books, so it's nice to own a few pages of them. Anything Goes number 5. We got a Eastman Laird cover of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was quite a get in that year. And this is a very silly story. It's Kevin Eastman, Peter Laird, and Ryan Brown helping him out. I think they're all doing everything. And it just shows it says the road trip, and it just shows the turtles running through the city. It's almost like they're on a mission, you know? And they're even leaving the city, and they sneak through the woods. Also, they can go to a drive-in theater where Aliens is playing. Not much of anything. But I'm sure it sold a lot of copies and helped Fantagraphics pay off their debts. A Short History of Sex by Mike Hoffman. Yeah, the more I see of Mike Hoffman, the more I realize this guy was such a good artist. Here's obviously his very cartoony style, which he's pretty facile at. And this is all pretty fun, clever stuff. Art Crumb gave him permission to reprint this comic from 1977. The Goose and the Gander Were Talking One Night. And this wasn't even in an underground comic. It was in Co-Evolution Quarterly. So that's pretty cool, because even if you were an underground comics guy who had all the undergrounds, you wouldn't have this story. So it's a reprint, but it's rare. I think I know it because it was in the complete Crumb. I'm pretty sure they reprinted it, that Fantagraphics put out. This is just a very mature Art Crumb story, just about this couple, this husband, and just he's really having angst and this feeling of doom and how the whole earth is doomed. Which I think a lot of us feel, especially as we get a little older. This is a story and art by Don Lomax on this one. The Super Colossal All Galactic Biltmore Brothers Mega Momentous Circus and Medicine Show. And it features this character, Captain Bizarre, Interstellar Gumshoe. I don't know if we've ever seen him before or since. But I gotta say, this is some of the slickest Don Lomax art I've ever seen. This is kind of appealing, some of these panels. It's nice. It looks like he really put his nose to the grindstone on this one. Because sometimes he's definitely off. You know, on certain panels, Don Lomax isn't very consistent. But this is some nice looking work. Basically, the main character is hired by this interstellar circus. The guy who owns it's a piece of shit, though. And our hero kind of gets the best of him at the end. The owner of the circus is a really bad guy, so he gives him some just desserts. Here we have Jim Rohn, the Holo Brothers. This is another series that was in that Threat magazine. This was the second of the third ones that were in there. And this is called Anything Goes, and it's illustrating the Cole Porter song, Anything Goes. You know, not much of a story. He's got a kind of interesting, fun cartoon style, but, you know, obviously very, like, I don't know, fanzine-ish fan art. But I always thought the cartooning looked good in these. I never read them. And from reading this, I don't think I ever am going to. I've never heard anyone say, like, oh, yeah, those Holo Brothers comics were great back then. So I'm pretty sure, just from word of mouth, that they're really not that good. I don't have to go seeking them out or anything. Here, once again, we get some a Little Orphan Annie sequence, because at the time, Fantagraphics was reprinting Little Orphan Annie. And they colored them, these dailies. And once again, I've never really read a Little Orphan Annie. I know it's supposed to be a great classic comic strip. So this is kind of nice, get a little taste. Little sequence from one of the story arcs. I kind of want to read more after reading this. Seems kind of interesting. Oh, and here we have the third serial that runs in Threat magazine. So I guess they just got all three guys to contribute to this. This looks the most interesting. This guy named Michael Krager. And I don't know what else he's done. This is very, like, just surreal and doesn't really make much sense, but some really nice cartooning and imagery in here. Like, kind of dreamlike, interesting. Pretty nice colors, too. This is really weird. Like, it didn't tell me where. I looked this up on the internet. So these were called Gwendolyn Wretch. And they're by Tom Sutton. They're from 1972. And they're like one-page, you know, gags. So I don't know if, like, Tom Sutton was trying to sell this to the syndicates to have a newspaper strip. It definitely has a very, like, early 70s greeting card style. I mean, this was such a popular cartooning style in the 70s. Many people drew like this. These aren't that funny, but it's kind of nice cartooning. I mean, in a kind of typical way. Really weird seeing Tom Sutton draw like that. If you remember, I know I've showed off Tom Sutton before, you know, just long-time horror cartoonist. He probably drew more horror comics than anyone. He did thousands of pages for Charlton, mostly their horror comics. And this is nice. We get a 4-page Journey story by William Mesner Loebs. Journey was a comic that Fantagraphics published in the 80s after Aardvark Vanheim published it. And these are great comics, just about a frontiersman in, like, the early 1800s. And just told, they're kind of funny, they're action-packed, just really well-told stories. I'm not, like, a huge fan of, like, frontier comics, but he made it really interesting. Colors in this are pretty nice. And just like in most Wolverine McAllister stories, a simple thing happens where a lightning storm starts, so he jumps into this log, and there's a skunk in there, and his arms are pinned, so the skunk could just rip his eyes out with his claws at any second. So basically, William Esner Loeb's always showed you that the frontier, it could be a beautiful day, and then all of a sudden it's life and death shit. You're staring it down. That's some really nice color there, too. Let me check out who did the colors on this. Oh, this guy named George Kochel. And in the credits, he's just kind of been all over. He's did a lot of coloring in the 80s for various alternative comic publishers. But that's pretty nice, this watercolor. Okay, here we got the last issue, number 6. A nice Usagi Yojimbo cover by Stan Sakai. And this issue goes to black and white. I guess they ran out of money, even on their benefit comic. Start off with a George Metzger story, the great underground cartoonist. And this is weird. It's totally drawn in a style I've never seen him drawn before. This total like Bigfoot cartoony style. I almost think that maybe George Metzger at this point hadn't drawn in years. He was kind of hadn't drawn an underground in a long time. So it's a humorous little thing about comic book conventions. We see all these like cameos of Popeye and Olive Oyl or punks, Grimjack, Ralph Snart. Yeah, I would never guess this was George Metzger if you didn't tell me. He's talking about some of his early conventions, running into Trina Robbins, crashing a new wave cartoonist party to get free pizza. It's not bad, though. George Metzger, I'd be curious to see if he developed this cartoony style more. Here we have a Matt Howarth story, Thicker Than Blood, a Keith Lama story. Matt Howarth, this guy's got such an odd career. Like, he was doing comics in like 69. He had comics on the early heavy metals in 77. And he would do album cover art, weird self-published graphic novels before that was even a thing. Like when there was barely any graphic novels out. Tons of independent comics. Apparently this guy's a workaholic. And he does just a lot of science fiction. One of his most famous comics was Those Annoying Post Brothers. And that was probably his longest running comic. But the guy, man, even though you might have never even heard of this guy, he's probably made more comic pages, writing and drawing, than almost any cartoonist you can think of. It's insane how much this guy has pumped out over the decades, and yet most of the time you don't even see it anywhere. It's just like kind of gets buried. So I guess Keith Lama is kind of like this interstellar detective troubleshooter. And she gets called in by these aliens, and they say, hey, we can't even translate this another human being. He did this crime. And we're not quite sure how to even translate it. And the reason why is because these people don't have the word for child molester. So this human guy basically molested one of these weird alien-looking children. And Keith Lama just says, do whatever you want to him. He deserves whatever you give him. He's all yours. Pretty odd little story. But as you can see, Matt Howarth, very unique style, but he knows what he's doing. Like, his style is dialed in. It always was. For, like, as long as I've seen his work since I was a little kid, obviously this guy has his style that he can do really well, and he doesn't really deviate from it. Here we got a nice Phil Elliott story. Just a cute little story. The great English cartoonist. I guess I shouldn't say great, because to be honest, I've never read a Phil Elliott comic that I really enjoyed. He's never really tickled my fancy. But I do like his, he's got this classically great, fun style. Then we get Eddie Campbell. And this is just a kind of a weird stream of consciousness strip. In fact, this part, it just looks like he was doodling and added some drawings, but then some of this is just like craziness, just ink splotches. But like most of his Alec work, this is just all the observations, all the word balloons, pretty great, great writing. And then this page just kind of turns into kind of a satire of religious belief. This one is Eternity's Wait, written by Stu Hopin. This guy did a few comics, like indie alternative comics. I should say independent. They weren't that alternative. In the 80s, he did some stuff for Fantagraphics. And this is, once again, art by Mike Hoffman. And man, I grew up reading this stuff, and I just thought Mike Hoffman was pretty good. Now I look back at him like, man, I love this guy's style. I wish he did more. And this is weird. It's about this guy named Digger Graves. And he's a old, aging pool hustler. At this point, he's just a drunk who's not very good. I love this first panel here, by the way. I just wanted to mention, we see all the planets and stars of the galaxy, and then it turns into the pool balls. And the writer Stu Hopin is like, he's kind of clever. I mean, but it's almost like he's too clever. Like all his comics are like, the captions are trying to be, say some clever pun or a clever thing. Almost like a really smart college kid would if he wrote a comic. Kind of showing off that like, oh, I'm trying to pack in all these ideas. And I say that as someone, the few times I've written, I do the same thing. And I thought it was clever and cool to do. And when I look back and read my stuff, I'm like, oh, God, you're trying so fucking hard. And that's what this guy seems to be doing. But some of his observations are pretty clever and interesting stuff. So not much happens in this comic. It's just like a character study, weird, almost metaphysical musings of this old character. I think the writing's pretty good, though, overall. I gotta say, it's a lot better than a lot of stories I read. Digger Graves falls into the sinkhole, and with all these fossils, and then he gets fossilized. But then he's reborn, but not really reborn. It's kind of like his ghost. He's a dead man walking. And he goes back to the pool hall, and all of a sudden he's great at pool. And then we see him. Kind of like Dope Rider's brother. So I don't know if he ever did more stories about this Digger Graves guy. Here we have a one-page De Luciano contribution. De Luciano was a longtime editor and writer at the Comics Journal who did a lot of mini comics. Loved Dada. And so this is obviously just, a bunch of clip art, craziness. A lot of fanzines in the 80s look like this. If you didn't grow up in the 80s, a lot of guys were doing this stuff. This is really odd. This Tom Sutton, I guess, allowed Fantagraphics to reprint the story from Barnyard of Fear. I think it came out in 77, 78. So it's a Tom Sutton horror story. Kind of about this vampire and this woman that the vampire turned into a lady vampire. And she's getting revenge on him, chops off his head. But then the main vampire has this basically hellhound, this demon dog. The art's pretty nice. Some really nice Tom Sutton art. But this is the thing that's really annoying. Well, I was reading this, just last night. And I was just like, I don't really get that ending. What? And the reason why, as I found out on Grand Comics Database, is for some reason Fantagraphics didn't reprint the last page of the story. So it's I don't know what happened. And so it just has this really non-ending because the last page is missing. Oh, and here we get a nice one-pager by Mark Martin of Nat Rat fame and Montgomery Wart, tantalizing stories. And this is just very cutesy. But man, he has a really appealing cartoon style. So just nice cartooning. It's kind of a cutesy comic about his son, Mark Martin's son, how he's obsessed with the alphabet. And that's it for Anything Goes, 1 through 6. These are definitely worth picking up. I mean, it was a nice anthology. And, I mean, sometimes outstanding. I mean, God, you got to get number 2 just for the Alan Moore story. Classic. But, hope you enjoyed it. Hope you can find these pretty cheap. I think they're very cheap. I don't think anyone gives a shit about these. And I hope to see you return here to the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies.